Go ahead. And yeah, so basically we advocate for local businesses, tech businesses up here in the north. And our mandate is to help grow the local tech sector. And we put a lot of these events on around tech related topics. So if anyone has any suggestions on future topics, just please reach out and we'd be happy to put one on for you. In today's talk, Tech 101 with Chin. Chin is the founder of Class C Narwhal. He has spent the past 7 years leading programs and supporting mission-driven and tech companies. His area of focus includes market validation, sales, company culture, process automation, and revenue optimization. He's also been working for Tech Yukon as well on our North of AI program, which we launched last year. So thanks, Chin, for doing this. We appreciate it. Also, this is an hour-long talk, but there will be time for Q&A at the end. And you can either put your questions in the chat or put your emoji hand up to ask questions in person. And yeah, should be good to go. So I'll hand things off to Chin.
Great. Thank you, Ziad. Before I start, I just want to check, do you all see the screens changing? Like, do you see my face now on the screen? Yes? Great, cool. A bit about my background so you understand the lens with which some of the things that I'll talk about comes from. I'm actually just in the midst of writing this blog post, and I think it's very interesting because a lot of us as entrepreneurs, we face what we call mentor fatigue, getting a lot of different advice and feedback from mentors. So it is very important for us to understand why some people are saying or giving the advice that they're giving you, because some of them might actually have, not to say ulterior motives, but some of them have a skewed perspective on things, which could be true and at the same time might not apply as well to you. So I'll give you one example. One of the things that you will often hear from investors is they might talk about things like the cycle and the timing. So the cycle of innovation. They might say, oh, in certain industry, a cycle of innovation is 10 years. Every 10 years, things are ripe for disruption and whatnot. While that might be true and might be especially relevant for an investor, for entrepreneurs, what is important for you to notice is that, yes, chasing opportunities like that can help put some sort of tailwind in your business. But what I often find is that entrepreneurs who actually ignore timing are usually the ones that are what I would say the more successful entrepreneurs. And what I mean by that is because they're actually more motivated to go after a business idea or start some sort of nonprofit because they have some sort of personal mission that they're trying to accomplish. They're trying to bring some form of value into the world. And those are the ones who tend to what I would call create the right timing instead of trying to meet the timing in the right place. So yes, timing can be important, but usually in most cases, you control what you can control. If timing is out of your control, you do what you can to actually make the best kind of environment for yourself and your business, such that you actually create the right opportunities for yourself to flourish. So yeah, a bit of my context, that was a bit of a segue, but a bit about myself. My name is Chin. I spent the last about 6 years or so working in social ventures. So I work for a social venture incubator accelerator. So for those of you who are not familiar with social ventures, these are basically companies that are for profit, but they also care about making the world a better place through some form of contribution, like let's say improving the environment, improving education, social justice, that kind of stuff. I would say I probably worked with close to about 500 or so companies and entrepreneurs over the last 7 years. In terms of my expertise and area of focus, it's around mostly sales and revenue operations. So that's things like optimizing pricing, sales training, building sales processes, that kind of stuff. So today's session, I actually want to run it a bit differently from a traditional workshop. I guess the most fun way to describe this is a seated Ask Me Anything session. So what I'll be going through is, you can see over here, there are 8 key topic areas or categories. And through those different categories, I'll introduce different concepts. Some of them you might be familiar with, some of them you might not. The idea here is that I won't go into too much depth in a lot of the topics, but at the end of each section, there will be some time for Q&A. So for example, I might say, okay, what is a patent? How can a patent, how does it work? It's something that you can protect your designs with. And then I want you to start noting certain things. So if you have questions around like patenting, like, when should I patent? What can I protect with a patent? How long does the process take? How much does it cost? Is it worth it? Does it really protect you? Those are the questions that you should bring up so that we can have more of a discussion at the end of each section. So I'll try my best to touch on as many things as possible, but I want you to really drive the conversation. So there will be certain things that you will know, certain things that you don't need me to go into a lot of depth. But the idea here is if you don't know anything, if you start to hear some concepts that are foreign to you, this is your opportunity to get your questions out there, right? So the 8 categories are understanding the startup lifecycle. We'll cover topics like startup, what's a startup, what's a scale up. We'll go into co-founder relationships. We'll talk about things like equity. We will talk about, oh, slides are not changing. Oh, do you see the overview now?
Yes.
Great. Oh, sorry, it wasn't changing before. Okay. Let me just check my settings just to make sure. I think it's a full screen thing. Let me see. Is it changing? Yes.
Yeah, it's changing now, Jim.
Okay, great. We'll talk about product development. So more about, how do we build a tech company? How do we build an app, a website? We'll talk about concepts like lean, UX, UI, tech stacks, wireframe, prototypes. We'll talk about funding specific things around tech startups. So, what is a seed round? What are angels? What is a VC? We'll talk about growth and revenue models. How do you price your product, freemium, flywheel, gamification, that kind of stuff. We'll go into sales and marketing. We'll talk about RevOps, concepts like sales cycle, what is A/B testing, what's a CTA. We'll talk about support organizations. So what are incubators, accelerators? What is the difference between a grant versus a tax credit? We'll also talk about some trending technologies as well, AR, VR, blockchain, AI, machine learning, that kind of stuff. So let's jump right into it. So again, just to quickly remind you, at any time, feel free to dump your questions in the chat or just write down your questions so that you can come off mute at the end of each section to ask your questions. So let's talk about startups. Excuse me. On a basic level, the key foundation of a startup is vision, mission, and values. So these are, I guess the simple way of putting it is the vision is kind of your why. Why does your business exist? Why are you running the business that you're running? The mission is what is your organization's role in manifesting that vision? And then the values is more about like, what is your how? How do you go about doing certain things? It's kind of like your ethics or your code of conduct. People often confuse vision versus mission. So I like to talk about this on a very basic level because a lot of people tend to focus a lot on the profit side of the business, which I think it is very important. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You need to also have clear and strong mission versus vision for your company, because it really helps you bring the right people to your team, motivate your employees, and also get the funders to really believe in what you're doing as well. So for example, here, Tesla as a company, the mission you can say is to accelerate the world's transition to sustainable energy. And let's say the vision there is to create the most compelling car company of the 21st century by driving the world's transition to electric vehicles. So you can see here how the company's mission plays into the grander mission. Make sense? So they're trying to accelerate transition to sustainable energy through electric cars. Other things to think about, other words or jargon around some of the more startup specific lingo. You'll often hear the word B2B, B2C. B2C stands for business to consumer. B2B is business to business. There's also B2G, business to government. Then you have different layers as well. In some cases, you might have a product where it's what we call B2C. That means you sell to a business which sells to their consumers as well. There are marketplace type of businesses as well. So marketplaces are, you'll often hear things like, let's say Airbnb. You have hosts on the platform and you have guests who stay in the host place. So you might be in that situation where you create what we call a double-sided marketplace. There could be even a multi-sided marketplace where you have vendors, you have consumers, and then you have sellers. So you can have more than one side to the marketplace. Let's look at the life cycle, or at least the main stages of the business. So the first stage of that most startups will go through is what I call problem solution fit. In problem solution fit, usually this is the very early stage where someone comes up with an idea and it says, hey, I want to create this product or this solution. Maybe it's an app, maybe it's a website, maybe it's a service, whatever it is. This also applies to non-tech companies as well. But the idea here is they want to create this solution, and in the fit between problem and solution, usually what's happening here is they're trying to understand who exactly has the problem. So who's the right target customer to go after? Number two is what is the right, I would say, love language. What's the right thing to say? What really resonates with the customer? So over here, then it really boils down to really understanding, what do consumers really need? What does the customer really need? And also understanding how do they tend to describe their own problems. But not only that, sometimes you might decide, okay, you know what? Maybe it's not just going after this consumer. Maybe I find that this consumer has a different problem. Do we want to do what we call a pivot? Do we want to change direction and actually address other problems that a customer might have? So often when you go through any sort of startup or entrepreneurship program, you might hear the thing or the term that they will say, there's a difference between a vitamin and a painkiller. The idea here is vitamins are solutions that are nice to have, solutions that are nice to have, but they don't really solve painful problems. And ideally, you want to be in a situation where you have some sort of painkiller to the customer's problem. Then it's something that they really, really want. The simpler way to think of it is, is it a nice to have versus a need to have? I would say it's okay to be building a product or service that is in the nice to have category. Although ideally you want to have something that is that painkiller. If you are building a product or service in the nice to have category, then the best way to really think about articulating what we call value proposition, which we can go to in more detail if you're not clear on what value proposition is you want to understand what is your customer's unmet desire. What do they want, but they can't currently get? So for example, you might look out there and you find that, oh, people have some sort of craving for zombie-related entertainment. So you're like, oh, you know what? Maybe I'll create a game that is zombie-focused. So that's trying to address that unmet desire. What's that nice to have that people are craving, right? In problem solution fit, I think I talked about this. So we're identifying who are the early adopters, what's the target customer, and how do we do that? We do that through customer discovery, user interviews. So again, if you're not clear on customer discovery, user interviews, bring that up in the Q&A, and I can go into more detail about that. We do things like market research. We think about market validation. So there's a difference between the two. Market research tends to be more around understanding, what the market is, what terms they're using, what keywords, what are they searching. Market sizing is more about understanding, is it, let's say, a $6 billion industry? What is the education industry in Canada versus what is your actual addressable market, let's say in North America, let's say in Vancouver, for example, or in Yukon. So you're trying to, through the different layers, try to estimate as best as possible what's the size of the market that you can address. And then you also have what we call market validation. So it's it's one thing to plan, to understand what the market is, and then it's another thing to really gauge actual demand. So you can actually say, oh, we think conservatively that we'll address 5% of the local market, and we think that we can capture that. But if you actually go out and launch, it might be a different story. People might not actually want your product or service. So that's market validation. Going out, speaking to customers, trying to gauge if they actually want to buy a product or service, if they actually need it. So that's all about proving the market in stage one. If you find that either the market is not receptive to your idea, your product, your service, or if let's say if the features that you've built into your app are not being utilized by a customer, then that's your time or chance to pivot. Or you'll also hear the term iterate. And the idea here is you need to make an adjustment. So a pivot or an iteration is basically you find that either you pivot around the customer, you say, okay, this customer has this problem or has this problem or pain point, but they actually don't really need certain things. Then then you can make the decision, okay, I'll go after and solve a different problem for them. So maybe I'll build different features in my app. Maybe I'll do different things. The other option might be, you might realize that, oh, you know what? This customer doesn't have this problem. And I'm actually not that passionate about serving this customer. Maybe I will serve a different customer that actually has a problem. I'll go out and look for a different target customer. So you could pivot around the problem. So you still remain true to the problem, but you're open and flexible with who you're addressing. So those are different ways. Or it could even be small things like changing your pricing or changing the features that you tier your paywall behind, right? So those are small things that we can consider a pivot or iteration as well. Sorry, Ziad, I am going very fast because there are a lot of things I want to cover. But I would try my best to speak as coherently as possible. So assuming you go through stage one, you get to a point where you have that fit, you understand, okay, I know who I'm serving, I understand the problem, marketing seems to be working, I seem to be getting in front of the right people, and they seem to be responsive and actually trying to, receptive towards buying my product or service. Then we move into what we call product market fit. So product market fit, you might hear this term again if you're in the startup world quite often, especially if you speak to investors. The idea behind product market fit is now you know that you have a solution that actually solves a problem. The next step is there strong demand such that you can start to scale to what we call the mass market? And product market fit, what does it look like? I would say that these are two simple indicators. Like one is if you're at a stage in your business where you start to feel that demand is starting to outstrip supply, maybe more users are joining your platform than your servers can support. Or maybe let's say if you are a physical product or goods company, people are buying your products more quickly than you can produce them. So demand is actually outstripping supply, then you are on the right path. You are starting to see that product market fit. Or maybe it might be the situation where you're doing exit interviews with your customers, or you're interviewing your users, and you're starting to see that people are in a situation where they would feel that they were very disappointed if your product was discontinued. So if you're in that situation, you're probably on the right track. It just means that you can start to think about optimizing rather than experimentation. So that's stage two. So here, usually what you're doing to try to get closer to product market fit, you're starting to experiment primarily around sales and marketing. So this is where you look at the different channels, the different language, what we call copy in marketing. I'll talk more about that. You're making sure that you're going after people with the right funnels. So how do you convert them? What's the process to get them to become a customer? So you're testing all of these different things. Assuming you have product market fit and you have problem solution fit, then what you can start to think about then is you can start to think about scaling. So scaling is where you can start to think about, okay, should I raise money? Should I hire more team members? Should I expand to new markets? And how do you know if you're ready to scale? What I encourage you to think about is look at these 5 things for metrics. So this is what we call pirate metrics, AARR. It stands for acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, and referral. And what it basically is it's a good indicator that you're on the right track on certain fields if you know what your acquisition channels are. So if you can confidently speak to someone, be it an investor or a team member, and you can say to them, hey, this is how I get my customers. So I get my customers when I spend, let's say, $5 on ads, on Facebook ads, that will bring in, let's say, 2 customers. So I know that my channel is Facebook. I know what my cost of acquisition is. So that is repeatable. So the keyword there is it repeatable, or are you still experimenting if you're sure, or is it something that's uncertain, right? Second one is, sure, you might be really good at acquiring customers. Maybe you're really good at marketing, but can you actually activate them? Will they actually use your product or service? So that's activation. What is your activation point? Is it when they put an item in their checkout? Is it when they download an app? Is that good enough as an activation? Or do you need to get a customer to the point where they actually make an order? And then after that, if you can prove that customers actually will use your product or service, then the next important point is retention. How long do they stay around? How long do they continue to use your product or service? Right. So obviously, if you try too quickly to scale, and let's say if you end up going to an investor and say, oh, hey, Mr. Investor, look, for every $5 that we spend on marketing campaigns, we acquire 10 new users or customers. And if the investor says, oh, great, you seem to be getting a lot of customers, maybe you're onto something and they throw money at you, but maybe you are actually not fixing some of the other problems. And you have, let's say, maybe poor retention, or maybe even worse, poor activation. People are not using your product service, or maybe great, customers download your app, but they never end up actually using it, or they download it and they use it for 2 weeks and they uninstall it. Then actually you have what we call a leaky ship, right? So you don't want to be in a situation where you end up scaling too quickly, because If you do that, then you could end up creating a very big leaky ship, which is a lot harder to fix as well. So the idea here is, what is retention? What's the lifetime value of your customer? Do they stay around long enough for you to actually be able to realistically make some form of revenue from them? And revenue here is basically how do you talk about money? What is either your average revenue per user, or is it your monthly recurring revenue? Is it your annual recurring revenue? You don't have to worry too much about what metrics to track. The idea here is just to understand what is the key metric you want to follow for each of those categories and what you want to talk about. And then lastly, referral. Referral is an indicator that people are advocates of your product, that people are willing to tell other people about your product or service. So that helps people understand that, number one, your product or service is actually creating value. And then number two, that it will actually grow organically, even if you don't spend any marketing dollars towards it. So I would say, if you're wondering when is the right time to scale, when's the right time to raise money, grow my team, expand to new markets, if you can meet at least the first three: acquisition, activation, and retention. You don't have to be making revenue in order to raise capital yet. But of course, nowadays, if you can actually talk about revenue in some form, that will help de-risk the opportunity for whatever the investor, or let's say the bank or government fund is. Referral, not absolutely necessary, but ideally you want to try to optimize all 5 of these before you move forward. So you just need to have the first 3 to start to think about scaling. Best case if you have all 5. So now you're really ready to start to scale. In the scaling phase, this is where you start to go out, you pitch, you do fundraising, you start to grow your team, start to optimize, start to automate, that kind of stuff. So in stage 1, stage 2 of the business, it's mostly in what we call validated learning. You are learning about the market, learning about your customers, what language they use. You're doing a lot of experiments, you're pivoting. In stage 3, it's what we call growth. You're starting to optimize. It's less about experiments, random trying different things. It's more about how do you actually double down on certain things, create processes, create templates, automation, that kind of stuff. Quite a lot I've covered there. Before I jump into competition, maybe I'll quickly insert some Q&A time here. Any questions so far? Great, Erica's asking, what's the difference between activation and acquisition? Also, when scaling in reference to ARR, are there specific metrics we should aim for? Great question. So activation and acquisition, I'll give you another example. So acquisition is knowing, number one, where are you getting your customers? So what channels they're coming from? What is your ROI in terms of investment? How much does it cost you to acquire those customers? So you might say, every $10 on Google Ads gives me 2 views on my website, for example, or will result in 2 downloads for my app, whatever that is. So that's acquisition. Activation, the main difference there is, in most cases, activation is not just the simple act of them downloading or coming to your website. It's usually something that's a bit more meaty. So one example is, there's this company called Foodie, and what they are is basically, it's a catering company for corporate events and corporate meetings. And in their case, acquiring a customer is just getting them to download your app or create an account on the website. Their activation point is when a customer actually makes their first order. So when a customer makes an order, then this actually makes it a legitimate customer. It's not just someone who has created an account. For example, let's say if you were a Facebook, for example, you might say that acquiring a customer is someone creating an account. Activation is when someone uploads their first post, for example, right? So that could be activation. You could have also what we call a secondary activation. So secondary activation is something that's a bit more meaty. So it might be like, let's say if you notice that people who make at least 3 or more orders on your platform tend to be more long-term customers rather than just transactional customers, then what you might say is, oh, we will try, everything we do in our business is we try to get people to that 3rd order. So you might actually do certain things like, give them discounts on their first 2 orders, or you might encourage them to use your platform. And then if you refer a friend, you get a free second order or something like that. And the idea there is if you can move them to that 3rd order, it tends to build enough of a habit around using your product or service such that they will continue to use it for a longer period of time. Other specific metrics, every business is different. So what you will be tracking will be really unique to your business. There are rough things that you can think about. So let's say for acquisition, the main thing I can say with metrics is you want to avoid what we call vanity metrics, and you want to go after more meaningful metrics. So for example, a like on a post, or even a download in this day and age is more of a vanity metric. So you want to look for more engagement metrics. So like comments, sharing. So it really depends on what you're tracking. Acquisition could be, let's say, account creation. If you're not building an app on a website, then maybe you don't look at account creation as activation. Maybe it's something else. Activation, again, what is that buying behavior? So it could be, let's say, for example, I'll take a non-tech example here. So activation for physical products is usually a bit harder to track for businesses. Like, let's say if someone buys a shirt, for example, how do you know if someone's wearing that shirt? So you might deliberately create some campaigns to encourage people to show you that they've activated on your product or service. So you might say, hey, post a picture of yourself wearing your new shirt, and then we'll give you a free coupon or something like that. And then that helps you track and see like how many people are actually activating. And then retention is, how often do people come back? How long do they stay with you? So it could be things like your lifetime value for your customer. It could be your churn rate. Let's say with an app, it could be, how long do they, when do they become inactive? Is it after 2 weeks that they stop using it? So you think about different things like that. And revenue could be, your annual recurring revenue. So you don't need to make it too complicated. You just pick one and choose whatever is easiest for you to track. And then you can just talk about that in your investor meetings or whatever it is. And then lastly, referral typically is tracked through what we call the Net Promoter Score. So Net Promoter Score is when you typically see those quizzes where they say, on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to refer our product or service to a friend? And if people are a 9 or 10, they are what we call promoters. If they're 7 or 8, they're neutral. If they're 6 or below, then they're what we call detractors. They'll negatively talk about your product or service. So there's a way to calculate it. So you can just search Net Promoter Score, how to calculate. And that helps you understand if your product or service is naturally, organically growing. Yeah. Any other questions? Again, just feel free to unmute yourself and jump in if you have questions. All right, assuming no, I'm going to move on. Competition. The 2 main things you will hear when people talk about competition is what is your competitive advantage, and then what is your differentiation. Advantage and differentiation could be the same, but they can also be different. A competitive advantage might be something like, you might say, oh, we leverage community effects, where, let's say if someone is, let's say LinkedIn, for example, if your friends are on LinkedIn, if your boss is on LinkedIn, it's much harder for you to go into another professional platform because all the people that you already know, your community is already on our platform, right? So that's your advantage. It makes it sticky, makes it hard for people to switch away. Competitive differentiation might be, oh, we do some things that the competitors don't do. We offer some features. We have a different way of doing some of the same things, maybe. So what is the differentiation? Yeah. Let's see if there are any other interesting points to talk on. But other questions around this? Anyone have any questions about like the startup stuff in general before we go into product development?
Actually, could I just shoot in a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. This is really great, by the way. I was just curious what the framework or theory comes from really around this whole the process with the 3 different stages mainly. How was that kind of developed naturally, I'm assuming, but yeah.
Great question. I To be honest, I don't know. I kind of tried to put this together myself. Generally, this is the observation that I see from most businesses. The term that they often use in startup training and in MBA programs is they have problem solution fit, product market fit, and the third one is they call it business model fit. So that's the scaling phase. So business model fit is where you typically you optimize around pricing, you optimize around understanding how you convert your customers, that kind of stuff. So that's kind of the rough stages. I don't know if there is a specific name for this framework or model because I put it together myself.
Yeah, no, that's great. I was just curious, but that makes sense. Thanks.
Great. Other questions? I can talk a lot about competition. I mean, this itself could be a 1-hour workshop. So. Right, I'll jump on to the next one then, if no questions. Co-founders and equity. Again, the goal with me speaking so quickly is just that I want to touch on the different things and expose you to some of the topics. And then this is where if you have specific things that you are wondering about in your business, if you're struggling with a co-founder problem, if you don't know how to divide equity, then you bring up these questions. Otherwise, I'm going to assume that you're fine and it's not relevant for you at this point in time, and then I will skim over it. So co-founders, the main thing I want to talk about here is understanding the difference between a co-founder versus the founding team. The reason why I want to emphasize this a bit more is that a lot of early entrepreneurs tend to bring early team members on board and call them co-founders. And the problem there is that there's a lot of expectation and baggage that comes with the term co-founder. So what I mean there is if someone thinks that they're a co-founder, they naturally think that they have to have a lot of say and influence in your business. And that might or might not be something that you want. Maybe you're okay with them being a part of that core team, but maybe you actually want to have more control. And if that's the case, then it might not be appropriate for you to call them a co-founder. So just be very mindful of the term co-founder. You can still compensate people with equity without paying them because maybe most startups don't have revenue. And you can actually do that by calling them a founding team member instead of a co-founder. And that just sets a different tone and expectation with them as well. So compensation, obviously this is top of mind for a lot of people. Salary, if you can afford to pay them, equity, and then revenue share and commission. These are the main ways to typically compensate someone. So revenue share, I like this term a lot because it helps people understand that they're in it with you and they can share a portion of the revenue that you're making. And it's a much better way of wording it rather than just saying commission. And you'll find that especially if you work with salespeople is that if you use the term commission, naturally a lot of salespeople will think that commission is capped. There's usually a certain upper limit for commission, and commission usually has a cap in terms of duration as well. So you might say, oh, you will get a portion of the revenue from this customer, but only for the next 2 years. And usually you typically do that deliberately with salespeople, because if you don't cap it, then the salesperson would actually lose motivation to sell over time, right? So the idea here is whatever you choose to use, it really depends on who you're bringing onto for your team and how involved and how motivated you want to keep them. So revenue share usually has no caps. So it could be a dangerous situation if you bring on a sales rep and you say, hey, you'll do revenue share. And let's say they sell 10 accounts and from there they make enough money on a recurring basis that they don't ever need to sell anymore, then you could be in a bad position. But at the same time, if this is someone who really cares about the business and is just not in it for the money, and they're actually passionate about your mission, then having them see that, hey, they can grow with the business as the business grows, then they will typically continue to be very motivated as well. So whatever tool you use really is all up to you. Royalties is just a different way of saying it as well. On the equity side, some people tend to not really understand how equity works. So there's a difference between shares, directly giving people shares, versus options. And the main difference there is usually what you choose to issue or give someone, you also have to be very mindful of the tax implications of it. So what I mean by the tax implications here, before we talk about vesting in the cliff, is If I give you shares right now, so let's say if I give Erica 100 shares, and each of the shares is worth, let's say $100,000, then those shares would actually be income that she gets, even though she's not actually selling the shares. So if you give an early employee or co-founder shares, that will trigger a tax event. So just be mindful of that. So sometimes people don't want that because they don't want to be bumped up in tax bracket, right? So sometimes what a lot of startups or businesses will do is they give you stock options. Stock options gives you the right to purchase those shares at a specific value at a future date. So you might say, oh, you can purchase 100 shares at 1 cent per share, and you can exercise those options at any date, right? So what happens is, let's say when your company gets acquired, or if your company goes public, and now those shares are worth $100 per share, they can turn around, exercise those shares at 1 cent per share, and immediately sell them to someone else at $100 per share. So that's how they make their profit. Make sense? When you talk about equity with early team members, you also want to understand how it's typically given. So the most common way is what we call the 4-year vest and the 1-year cliff. So what the 4-year vest looks like is, let's say if you bring someone on board and you say, okay, I'm giving you, let's say 12% of the company. And 12% is, let's say, $10,000, 10,000 shares. If it's vested over 4 years, what happens is if they leave the company in the first year, so maybe they leave because they decide that they want to get a job, or if you decide they're not a good fit because they're not pulling their weight, then in the first year, there's this cliff. That means you can kick them out or they can leave, and they are not entitled to any of those shares. So your company can claw back all of those shares. Make sense? So that just ensures that people don't jump on and then jump off. And then what happens is every year, it's vested. So they are entitled to those 10,000 shares, but they don't get it immediately. So after the first year, they lock down 25% of that. So they lock down 2,500. And then if you decide to fire them after the first year, they will still keep 2,500, but you can claw back 7,500. Make sense? And then after the second year, it's 50%. They've locked down. After third year, 75. And then after 4 years, they fully vest all of their shares. That just encourages people to stay around with the business. So that's mostly for early co-founders. Any questions on shares of stocks? No. Cool. The other common way of distributing equity is what we call slicing pie. So the first one is what I call the traditional method. The second one is slicing pie. There's a whole book about it. You can look it up. Slicing pie has specific formulas, and they talk about allocating equity as you go. So it's based on the contributions that you put into the company. So contributions being like amount of time, how much your time is worth, amount of investment that you put towards the company, IP that you assign to the company, that kind of stuff. So there's a whole set of complicated formulas and ways to attribute, like, if you're the founder, you get a certain amount of equity. If you're the idea person, if you're the tech person, if you bring in an investor, whatever it is. And then another common term you might hear is ESOP. So ESOP just stands for Employee Stock Option Plan. Just know that at the end of the day, it's not usually common for most startups to allocate all of their equity when they start. All you really have to do when you incorporate a company is allocate about 55% of at least 55% of your company. Sorry, 51% of your company. So that is majority stakeholder. The rest, usually you'll set aside for fundraising or for your ESOP. Another one I want to just touch on very lightly is diversity and inclusion. There's a difference between diversity, and there's a difference between inclusion as well. A lot of companies tend to focus on diversity metrics. They say, oh, number of indigenous indigenous employees that we have, or number of people of color in our company. Diversity is a measure of the outcome. What is more important is to create a culture of inclusion where people feel welcome, where people feel comfortable engaging in those discussion and discourse. And as a result, diversity will follow. Just be mindful of that. Hire versus contracting. Yeah, so you can always bring people on board as an early contractor at the start, especially if you don't have the cash flow to actually justify hiring someone. The one thing you have to be mindful about is especially around the legal side. I'm not a HR expert, but sometimes you can get in trouble if you contract someone, but you treat them like an employee. So the main difference here is if you're contracting someone, you can tell them what you want done, but you can't usually dictate how exactly it's done. So you can't give them specific work hours. You can't tell them where to work. You can't tell them that they have to use your computers to work, that kind of stuff. If you're their only sole employer, then usually they can be categorized more as a hire rather than a contractor. So just be careful about these kind of things, because you could get into the wrong situation with CRA if you accidentally hire someone, although you see them as a contractor. Cool. Any questions here so far on team, co-founders, equity? Right, product development. One thing that you want to be very mindful about, which actually it was my biggest mistake for my first startup, is not differentiating the difference between a user and a customer. So user and customer can be one and the same, but sometimes they could be different. So for example, my first business, we were creating a food app where people could go into a restaurant, open up the app, and see what was the most popular dish in the restaurant. The user was the consumer, but we were trying to monetize from the restaurants. We were trying to get the restaurants to pay us for bringing them customers. And obviously, because we built and focused so much on the users, we actually did not look at what the customers really cared about. And because of that, they were not willing to pay for this app. They couldn't, it wasn't easy for us to justify that they were actually getting more customers through our app. We didn't build the right tracking and analytics for it. So just make sure you understand the difference between who is your user, who is your customer. If they are one and the same, that's fine. If they're different, make sure that you're actually creating tangible value for your customer as well, so that you can talk about it. In terms of project management, so if you need to start to work with a development firm, or maybe if you work with developers, the common method nowadays is what we call the lean method for development. The traditional is what we call the waterfall, right? Waterfall is you spend a whole bunch of time designing, building a product, and then you release, and then at the end of it, you have some feedback or customer support. The lean method is more about smaller iterations. So instead of building a full-on launch, like let's say a simple way of thinking it is, if you look at Windows, let's say a Windows update, from Windows 10 to Windows 11, like that is like a waterfall. Lean is more like the regular small updates that you get, like small changes. So you do a small build, do a quick release, get some feedback, and upon that you make some improvements, you do another build, you do another release, and then you get some more feedback. So that's a bit more common nowadays. You'll also often hear the term Agile versus design thinking. They're somewhat related to the lean methodology itself. Lean is more of a production process. It really comes from the manufacturing world. So that's where the terminology comes from. I would say that lean is something that you can apply not only to product development for an app or website, but it's the concept of lean is something that you can apply to anything in the organization. It could be, oh, we're trying to run a lean team meeting, or we're trying to have a lean marketing process. Agile is specific to the software development process itself. And then design thinking is just mostly the design process that emphasizes putting the user first, rather than jumping straight to making assumptions and focusing on the product design itself. If you're not familiar with the difference between like what is Agile, what is Scrum, how does it play into lean, that kind of stuff. The Scrum is a type of framework. Agile is the methodology. So Agile is about how do we do those quick iterations, that quick build, release, and then get feedback. Scrum is the specific step-by-step development process that a developer and their team will go through. So within Scrum, you have your product owner, your Scrum master, and your dev team. And then what they typically do is they go through this cycle. So the first they do story building. They focus on the user's use cases for the product. They create a product backlog. They decide what features they want to build. They plan the meeting, and then they sprint. Usually the sprint itself is about 2 to 4 weeks. And from there, they actually deploy, get the customers to try it. And then from there, they have daily stand-ups to check in with the team on progress. So yeah, that's the Scrum. And then the sprint itself is just a specific time when they actually sit down for the 2 to 4 weeks and just focus on building. Susie's asking, do I have any thoughts on how to find a developer? Great question. Developers in most countries are highly sought after in this day and age, because now almost every company is a tech company in some form. What I would say is most developers, number one, if you go and try to approach any generic developer, they will usually have pretty high ask in terms of salary. So most of you will not be in a situation where you can immediately hire a developer on day one. So what are the alternatives? One is to try to find what we call kind of like an early developer team member or co-founder. You might or might not call that person a CTO. Maybe they're not qualified to be a CTO. Maybe you just need them to help you build the initial version of the app, and then that's good enough. Another case is to outsource. So outsourcing, you might outsource offshore. Maybe you work with an app development firm that is what we call nearshore development and offshore development, or even local development. So you have an agency, like an app development agency, where they have a team. They can say, oh, you know what, you have an idea, you come to us, you pay us a certain fee, we build it for you. Nearshore is usually maybe they're not working locally, but they're working out of the country with a more distributed team. Cost might be lower. And then you have offshore where it's more like, let's say their whole team is in India or somewhere else like Philippines, and it's usually much more affordable. But as you have a team that is further and further away, then usually typically there's more problems around miscommunication or expectation as well. So just be very mindful of that. So if you do decide to go the agency route, then what I would say is you need to know very clearly what you want to have built and what it should look like. So typically what I find is people have bad experiences with agencies when they don't understand how app development works, and they don't really understand, what are some of the problems that can creep up, common delays, what we call scope creep, where actually you say like, oh, actually, you know what, I want you to build this too. And then they might actually come back to you with a higher quote. So just really understanding and managing that expectation around the process. As long as you do that, you should be okay working with an agency. If you're trying to find a developer that's more like a co-founder or early team member, then usually the most important point is finding someone who really is passionate about the mission and vision of your company. If they're not excited about what you're trying to build and they're just in it for money, then they will see themselves more as an employee, and then you have to pay them a salary, right? So good places to try to find as a team member is there are events called hackathons. So hackathons are events where you can actually go out, pitch your idea, and form a team around your idea and get people to work on building it. Those I find are actually pretty good places to find developers. Agencies, depending on where you're in, usually there are local agencies. Like in Whitehorse, Bizont is one company. Who else yet? A few people probably. Yeah, Susie, I don't know where you're based in, but every region has usually their main companies that people will work with. But I would say, if you're not sure where to start, maybe you could approach startup lawyers, ask them if they know any. You could approach startup advisors in your local community. So let's say in Whitehorse, for example, you can approach Innovate and Entrepreneurship with the university, or you can approach Ziet, Tech UConn, he should know as well. Uconstruct, they might know a few people as well. So yeah, start there. Great. Other things to think about is just, should I build an app, like what we call a native app? Native app would be an app that is in the actual iOS App Store and Android Web Store. Or are you building a website, or are you building what we call a web app? A web app is basically, a web app is more, it's actually more of a website that is mobile first, and it's launched through like a mock native app. So you can actually download it through a Play Store, for example, or iTunes. But when you click on the icon, it actually brings you to a website and it launches a web version of it. So don't always think that you have to build a native app, because nowadays a lot of people don't like installing apps, don't like having extra apps on their phone. So whatever form your product or service takes, it might not actually be optimal to have it as an app. Maybe it's better to have it as a website. It really depends on how users want to actually get value out of your product or service. Division of labor, what is front end, what is back end? Excuse me. Front end is what the customer sees. So that's the user interface. What do they see when they try to interact with the app, when they create an account? Backend is what you see or what your development team sees. It's how do you upload content? How do you make updates? How do you manage the data? So if there's a database, that kind of stuff. UI, UX, if you're not familiar with the difference, UI is user interface and UX is user experience. The easy way of thinking of it is UI is the graphics, like the colors, excuse me. The design. UX is where you put the buttons, like how do people try to do certain things. You can have very pretty user interface, very nice colors and nice designs, but you can also be in a situation where you have poor user experience, where people can't find the buttons or the menus for what they're trying to look for. Here's a good example, right? Good UI, for the ketchup bottle, versus the user experience itself. People getting stuck, can't get their ketchup out. Right? So better UX here. Excuse me, so much talking. So usually when you come to prototyping, when you start to build your product, then you have wireframes. So these are what we call low fidelity mockups. So that's a simple, basic version of your prototype. It helps people understand what your app or website is trying to do. Roughly what you're trying to display to the customer, what buttons are where. When you click on certain things, where do you go next? So that's all done in the wireframe. And then once you've done that, you move on to what we call high fidelity prototyping. So this is more, you've already done the UX, now you put in the UI. What does it actually look like? How does it feel? What are the colors? And then from there, you actually build a functional prototype. So something that people can actually use, can actually create an account, can actually make a purchase, create a transaction, that kind of stuff. MVP. This is also something that's quite common. MVP stands for minimum viable product. The idea here is oftentimes, if you're starting to prototype as you start to test your idea, the lowest hanging fruit to gauge demand might not necessarily to actually go out and jump into building an app itself. Maybe you could actually do something else like, put out a press release, create an ad, or create a video and see how people react to it. So we've seen this done in many, many different ways. So for example, some people, they use Kickstarter campaigns. They use that to gauge demand, to do some fundraising. Some people do, let's say, they create fake ads that will point to a website. And if no one's clicking the ads, then they know there's no demand for this, or either we're targeting the wrong customer or we're using the wrong language. And then from there, they actually tweak things before they move into development, right? Dropbox is a good example. Dropbox themselves, how they raised money and how they got early customers, they actually started by launching a video. They showed people what the cloud could look like. Like you could actually drag and drop a file into your phone and it will sync to your computer, or all the different computers that you have linked up to Dropbox. And people didn't understand that back in the days, because back in the days, you were file sharing through CDs and DVDs and rapid share and mega upload, those kind of file sharing websites, right? So creating a video could really help people understand what's the value, what you're trying to do. And then from there, you can use that to gauge demand, and maybe you can capture some early signups. Launching and testing. So typically for most apps or tech companies, you have what we call the alpha release and then the beta release. Alpha is more pre-release. In alpha, it's usually you and your team internally testing the product. And then your beta release is when you officially launch and actually get live users, live customers to actually try and test it out. Tech stack. This is usually a term that is more for developers. So there's front-end tech stack, you have back-end developers, database-focused developers. So all of them, it just depends on what tools they're familiar with, what coding language, do they use, let's say, Node.js, .NET, MySQL. So usually what we try to do is a lot of early founders or early tech people will look for what we call a full stack developer. A full stack developer is usually someone who has at least competency in each of those categories, right? They know at least one front-end language, one backend, one database, version control, and one project management tool, right? Other things you might hear in the tech space, what is open source, cloud, API. So open source is basically just making your coding or resources available such that the public can view it. Having something on the cloud just means that it is not hosted on a local computer. It's hosted across multiple computers. So that's the cloud. And then the API itself is basically being able to open integration of your product or tech with other tools like, let's say, Zapier, or integrate with Salesforce or HubSpot, that kind of stuff. Any questions on the product side of things? Okay. It's 12:59. I'm probably going to run a bit over time. Let me try to fight for a few more. Funding. So typically, the main categories of funding is we have bootstrap. So bootstrap is basically you're sustaining your company with your own revenue. So you're not raising capital from investors. And then you have what we call dilutive funding. So dilutive is usually you're giving away equity in exchange for some capital. So that's typically fundraising through investors. And then you have non-dilutive. Non-dilutive is things like tax credits, grants, loans are non-dilutive as well. So I've covered that. ICO. ICO is initial coin offering, popularized with the crypto movement. I don't generally encourage people to do an ICO nowadays because there's a lot of bad rap with ICOs and a lot of investors don't trust it. So if you're thinking about ICO, we can talk about that offline. Crowdfunding. So typically you have what we call reward-based crowdfunding, like Kickstarter, Indiegogo, where if people fund your project, you give them swag, like a pin or a t-shirt, or maybe early access to your product. Or you have equity-based crowdfunding as well. So equity-based crowdfunding is fairly recent. I would say it's probably about 5-6 years old. In Canada, one of the big ones is Frontend. In US, there are different agencies that do it. But the idea here is basically you can raise capital from the public. They don't have to be an accredited investor to invest in your company. But there are certain limitations. There's a certain amount that you can raise for equity crowdfunding. And also there's a maximum amount that each individual investor can contribute to as well. And that allows you to raise from the public, from a crowd, without them counting as individual people on your cap table. So if you're not familiar with what the cap table is, basically when you raise capital, each investor becomes one person on your cap table. And if you have more than 50 people on your cap table, you have to become a public company, which is quite an expensive process. So usually with equity crowdfunding, all of that is managed in some special legal tool. And what happens, all of the public investors, they sit as one item on the cap table instead of as an individual item on the cap table. There's what we call the angel and the VCs. Angels are basically private investors, individuals that are very wealthy. That's basically an angel. They're investing their own money. A venture capital is usually a firm that is managing money on behalf of many individuals. So, if you have mutual funds, some of them, they put money towards a venture capital firm, or maybe a venture capital firm might have raised money from multiple angel investors. And because a venture capital is usually managing funds that come from other people, they will have certain investment criteria. So the biggest difference there is at VCs, they will be more conservative with how they invest their money, but they can usually invest a lot more money in your business. So what you usually see is the early stage, most VCs won't touch you. You typically raise your, what we call the seed round or your first round of funding from angels. And then VCs will come once your business is a bit more mature, where you have actually metrics to report, you have some more solid data. And then in the VC stage, typically they will only seriously consider companies that are at least making a million a year in revenue. Yeah. So rounds, you have what we call the seed round. So seed round is typically your first formal round of investment. And when I say formal round here is pre-seed, you have what we call the friends and family round. Sometimes even if you don't have actual friends and family, you might still have a friends and family round if you have like one very strong investor or two strong investors who come in. Usually in a seed round, you're typically raising about $500,000 to about 2 million or so. The amount you raise will also vary depending on region. If you're raising $1 million in Canada, that's the seed round. If you're raising a seed round in US, it's typically about $10 million, right? So if you do bring in foreign investors into your round, you have to be very mindful of what term you're using with them as well, because they will have a different lens and they will think about different things when you talk about the seed round. Series A is usually after you raise your seed round. Typically, you're raising about 5 to 10 million in Canadian standards, and then your B and C and whatnot is just your subsequent rounds. So usually, the lower down the alphabet you go, the more money you're raising. A bridge round is typically when you are raising some amount of funding to get you from A to B or from C to A, and it's not enough to justify valuation at a higher level. So maybe, for example, you might say, okay, we are raising a seed round of 1 million, and that will allow us to be valued at this amount of money. It might value us at, let's say, a $5 million company. And then we plan on raising a Series A next year, and that will allow us to value ourselves at, let's say, $50 million. But if you somehow, through some bad luck, let's say, don't get to hit your revenue targets, you might need to raise a big bridge round and extend your runway before you can actually raise your next round of funding. So that's the bridge. Usually in the bridge round, you raise a smaller amount and you raise it at the same valuation as the prior round. So typically that's how it goes. Pitch deck, if you haven't heard of the terms, pitching is basically you're just telling your story, talking about your company to an investor. You can also be pitching to, let's say if you're in a hackathon, you're pitching to the crowd, right? You're pitching team members. So that's basically just you talking about your business. The pitch deck is usually like a PowerPoint presentation or a Google presentation. And it's just the visuals that you use to go along with your pitch to articulate and talk to people about your business. It's now the most common tool. Even if you're raising from banks, some of them, they don't really like to look at business plans anymore. So usually they say, send your pitch deck over, and that slideshow or PDF will actually have all of the basics of your company. Valuation. So valuation is basically just how much is your company is worth, and then dilution is how much are you diluting each round, how much equity are you giving out in order to get the money that you're hoping for. So for example, if you're raising $1 million in exchange for 20% of your company, that means that your total valuation of your company is $5 million. Process, if you hear the term due diligence and you don't know what it means, it's basically them doing their background research and reference checking to make sure that you're a legitimate company. So it could be a funder, an investor, a bank doing due diligence on your company. So they will ask you to send over things like, send me your financial forecasts, send me your resumes of your team members, right? Send me your patents, that kind of stuff. So that's the due diligence process. Cap table we've talked about. Exit strategy, excuse me. So exit strategy is usually more of an investor term. They want to know how will they get their money back, or what do you plan to do to exit your company? Do you plan on selling your company? Who are potential buyers? What is the time frame? Do you plan on going public? Is your plan to run it for life? Maybe you have no exit strategy. You can talk about that as well. So usually investors will ask you, what is your exit strategy? Acquisition, IPO. IPO is basically going public. Value proposition, investors use this term a lot as well. The biggest difference here is that you need to be able to talk about what is the value that you create for your customer. So an easy way of thinking of it is simplify Mario, right? Mario is your customer. your product is the flower, but when you give Mario your product, he becomes Super Fire Mario. So he becomes invincible, he can walk through monsters, he won't die, he can throw fireballs. So the idea here is, what does your product or service enable your customer to become? Does it make them someone who is more cool? Does it make them someone who is more adventurous? What is it? On the legal side, IP stands for intellectual property. We have patents, trademarks, and what we call non-disclosure agreements. So the main difference here is trademarks, copyright, is more related to language, wording, visuals, logos, branding, that kind of stuff. Patenting and IP is more related to the actual process, the actual design of your product itself. The coding, if it's a physical product, it's the actual design itself. And IP is basically, who owns it? What's the intellectual property? So typically whoever invented the product or service, they own the IP. But if you have a company, you need to assign the IP to the organization. That means you say now the company owns this IP. It's not owned by an individual. Non-disclosure agreements is basically just if you're talking to people and you want to make sure that they're not going to blabber away and tell other people about your idea, then you get them to sign that so that they won't talk about your idea to other people. Any questions on these so far before we move on? And I think we're in the final section. But any questions? How much is it usually to fund legal, especially for startups? So this is a tough question for me to answer because every situation is different. So the main thing you want to consider is, again, don't take this as legal advice. For every business, you will have what we call debt. And when I say debt, you will have technical debt, legal debt, financial debt, right? So there will be certain things that you will get away with by duct taping everything together and not using formal documents, or maybe even not using the right technology for it. So when do you tend to use the right technology? I would say my personal recommendation as an advisor is legal comes into play if you know that there is some level of risk that is inherent. So for example, if you don't trust your co-founders, for example, maybe you want to sooner rather than later get certain written agreements in place in terms of equity, in terms of IP, that kind of stuff. But at the same time, if that's a problem, then don't let legal be your crutch to manage trust. Because if you have a trust issue, then they're not the right people to go into business with to begin with. And no amount of legal will save you, right? Makes sense? Legal costs, typical incorporation with a startup, with a legal firm is usually in the range of about 1,500 to about 3,500. So that's just basic incorporation paperwork, shareholder agreements, some basic IP, that kind of stuff. Right, no problem, Hadrat. So I'm recording a session, so you can see the recording after that as well. What I would usually say is I don't generally recommend incorporating until you have some form of demand for your product or service. So if you know, if you've done some testing, you've put out some ads, or if you tried to acquire customers, or you have some prototype and people are interested in using it, and if you're starting to make revenue, then you definitely want to incorporate. But if you're still in that research, experimentation phase, development phase, usually I don't recommend incorporating that early. The caveat to that is it's better to incorporate early in certain cases, because let's say if you plan on receiving funding from certain grants, then some of them require that you have been incorporated for at least a year. So in that case, you want to incorporate sooner rather than later. And then again, just to protect yourself, then you want to generally try to assign the IP to the organization as early as possible, because if you just work with a team, it's not incorporated. If they run away and say, okay, I'm going to build this on my own as my own company, then you could be in trouble there. So I'd say to each their own. When you decide you're ready for it, it depends on your own comfort level and your risk. All right. Revenue and finance, some basics here. So revenue model, the main or more common ones you'll hear is freemium. So freemium usually means that there's a free version of your product or service, and then there's a premium version where they have to upgrade to unlock certain features or certain things. And then there's this term called the paywall or the pay gate. The paywall or the pay gate is basically what are the features that are locked behind that paywall. So for example, you might say, okay, it's free to create an account, upload posts, but once you want to reply to a message, like you need to upgrade an account. So that's the paywall or the pay gate. Or it might be like, oh, you send 5 messages for free, and then any more than that, like it's tiered. And let's say, 10 to 15 messages, it's a certain price, and then more and more, it's a different price, right? Transactional business model is common as well. Usually more common in marketplaces like Airbnb, where you enable your customer or your user to transact on your platform and you take a cut of it. A subscription, where you get them to pay a monthly fee. So that's another common way. On the finance side of things, you also want to be mindful of the difference between a budget versus a balance sheet. Okay, no problem, Grace. So a budget is basically just you and your planning. It's not indicative of actual cash flow through your company. So you might say, hey, we plan on spending this much money in month 1, month 2, month 3. So it's more around like your financial forecast itself. So budget is more of a management process. The balance sheet is what actually cash flow coming in, cash flow going out, what's actually happening on the day-to-day. So sometimes they could be one and the same. Sometimes they could be very, very different because what actually happens day-to-day might not be what is actually reflected in how you actually budget if you're not accurate with it. Other common things that you need to be mindful about. So cash in bank is basically just how much you have in your bank. Monthly expenses, the common word that they use here in financing is what is your burn rate? Burn rate just means how much do you spend every month. Maybe it's your employees that you have to pay, who's on payroll, the tools that you're using, that kind of stuff. And then from there, if you know your cash in bank and your burn rate, you should be able to calculate your runway, right? So if you have 10,000 in bank, you burn 20,000 a month, your runway is 5 months. After 5 months, you go bankrupt. Right? Break even. So simple calculation here. Again, this is oversimplified, but let's say 6-month cost is $2,000. You plan on selling $40 for your unit or your widget. That means you need to break even, you need to sell 500 units in 6 months. Make sense? Any questions on the financing side of things? All right, sales and marketing. Sorry, this is the second last section. Sales in search, we have SEM, SEO. If you're not familiar with them, SEM is search engine marketing, SEO is search engine optimization. SEM basically means that you are optimizing your company in order to be found as easily as possible through whatever search engine you're using. Maybe it's TikTok, Google, Facebook, Instagram. So you're using keywords, tagging, that kind of stuff. SEO is just how do you optimize it? So are you actually creating more content? Are you using the right keywords? Are you is there intent versus action, right? Do customers actually bounce on your website when they come to it? Do they stay around? Do they actually get what they're looking for? Landing page, you'll hear this commonly as well. A landing page is basically just a website. It's just a one-page website. Typical best practice for a landing page is that your one-page website shouldn't have your full website on it. That means it shouldn't have your menus that direct to your About Us or all of that. And the idea is that when you put your landing page out there from an ad, people click on the ad, they go to your landing page, they can only do one thing. That is, they can either express interest, or if they don't do anything, that means they're not interested. So landing pages are good for testing demand. You'll hear CTA. CTA stands for call to action. So what is that call to action? Is it to learn more, to read more, to buy now, to download a guide, to book a consultation? So there are different practices like you can look into like what's the best color depending on what's the call to action. Like buy is usually red, learn more is usually blue, that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff that we can go into. CRO is what we call conversion rate optimization. So what you're trying to do here is you're trying to optimize how people convert to the next step, whatever the next step is. Is it to book a meeting or is it to download your guide, right? So how do you improve that click-through rate? How do you improve that email response rate? So that's what we call CRO. Click-through rate is basically usually applicable to buttons, like how do you get people to click on the next button to go through, right? So this example here is, if you have the more fields someone needs to fill out, the less likely people are to take action. If they need to fill out their email and a password and sign up, then that's less of a next step. If you only have to fill out an email, that's a 40% increase. If there's only a sign up button, then 80% of people will click on that. A/B testing, you might hear that term, or what we call multivariate testing. A/B is just basically when you're comparing two options. Multivariate means you're comparing more. Most people will start with A/B testing. You only get into multivariate testing if you have a large sample size. And to give you a rough idea, to be statistically significant for A/B testing, you need at least 1,000 users on each case. So if you are trying to do ABCD multivariate testing, you need a lot of user flow to go through. Copyright versus copyright. Excuse me. Copyright, I talked about, so that's more around trademarking. So making sure you have rights to like certain names, taglines, that kind of stuff. Copywriting is more the language that goes into your marketing or your sales scripts. So what do you say in the ad? What do you say in the button to get people to click now to buy now, right? So that is basically the copyright. Metrics, I think we've talked about that. Vanity metrics, your likes, more valuable metrics like leads generated, cost per lead, your lead quality. So again, you'll have this slide so you can look at this later. Engagement, how do you define when people actually use your product and engage in it in a meaningful way? Are they sharing? Are they commenting? DAU stands for daily active users, MAU monthly. Retention rate and churn. So retention rate just means how long do they stay with you? Churn is usually within a specific cycle. You could say monthly churn. That means how many people leave on a monthly basis. Net promoter score, we talked about this. Flywheel model. Flywheel basically means that you have a model where your customers will promote your product, get more people to come in, and continue to grow your product or service. PR stands for public release or press release, public relations or press release. ROI, return on investment. Sales, we have CAC, stands for customer acquisition costs. LTV is lifetime value. Sales cycle is just how long it takes for you to convert your customer. Is it a 6-month sales cycle? Is it 3 months? MRR, monthly recurring revenue. ARR is annual. ARPU is your average revenue per user. Again, I can go into a lot of depth. If you want me to talk about how to optimize sales cycle, that itself could be a half-an-hour workshop there. So any questions on revenue, sales, marketing? All right, last piece, support organizations. Some of you might hear the term incubators. Incubators are basically organizations that focus on helping you get from idea to launch. So it's mostly focused around what we call market validation training, helping you understand how to do customer discovery, how to articulate your product, how to do your business planning, your strategy, that kind of stuff. Accelerators are typically getting you from launch to growth. So they are more focused around mentorship, more focused around fundraising, more focused around the network and connecting you to the right people. And then sometimes we have what we call a venture studio. A venture studio is more about you coming to them and they will basically give you their team and build your product or service for you and help you with even sales, launching it, marketing it, that kind of stuff. Obviously, if you're working with a venture studio, typically they will take a bigger cut of your company. Incubators and accelerators, some of them will take equity. Most incubators typically are fee-based. So it's usually paid for by the government, or usually you pay a fee to join the program. A lot of accelerators, you'll hear things like Y Combinator, Techstars. They usually give you money, but they take some equity in exchange. Very minimal in terms of how much money they give you. Equity, they typically take about 7 to 9%. Mentors, advisors, board of directors. The main difference is a mentor is someone who guides you personally, not just with your business. And it usually is long-term. Advisor is usually very specific to certain things in the business. So you could have an advisor that helps you with your product launch. You could have an advisor that helps you with crowdfunding. You could have an advisor that helps you with product development, or a sales advisor, right? A board of directors is a bit different. Board of directors are people who are legally liable to your company. That means they will usually be held accountable if your company does something that is inappropriate. So usually if you have a board of directors, you'll have regular meetings, like monthly meetings or even quarterly meetings and annual meetings. Advisors, they are more informal. You might be compensating them. Maybe you give them some equity. Maybe you pay them by the hour. But it's all up to you to set that schedule for meeting with them. Any questions on those? And just to wrap it up, trending technologies, before I jump into these, my main consideration for you or encouragement is don't jump to using things just because it's cool. Like right now, a lot of people are talking about the metaverse. A lot of people don't even understand what the metaverse is. If it's not something that actually creates value for your business or for your customers, then don't just jump onto the bandwagon. But just to help you understand the lingo out there, AR stands for augmented reality. So AR is basically a layer on top of what's already existing. So for example, like Pokemon Go is a good example. Right? You're using your phone camera, you're seeing something in real reality. VR is virtual reality. You're actually immersed into a separate reality. So it's not layered on top of existing reality. HUD is your heads-up display. The heads-up display is a form of augmented reality. So you see this in cars. Blockchain and crypto are different. So do know that. Some people tend to think it's one and the same. Blockchain is basically that you're using a network to actually manage and track certain data. So I won't go into details of how exactly the blockchain works, but crypto is basically tracking currency using blockchain. So that's the only difference there. And crypto is usually their own form of currency, either Bitcoin, Litecoin, there's many different ones, Ethereum, that kind of stuff. NFT is also quite popular nowadays. NFT stands for non-fungible token. I would say that the easiest way to talk about NFT is like art on the blockchain. So it's different from crypto. You're not owning money, but you're owning some form of usually an art. It could be physical art, it could be a song, it could be rights, it could be a video. Some people confuse owning the art to owning the rights to an art. So I've seen some people where they say like, oh, I've purchased, let's say, for example, Linkin Park's album as an NFT. Doesn't mean that you make money every time the album is being streamed, because the NFT could mean that you own the album, but you don't own the rights to the music itself. So depending on how the NFT is set up, you need to be very mindful of what you actually own. IoT stands for Internet of Things. It's basically talking about how a lot of devices nowadays are interconnected, like Amazon Alexa connected to your thermostat, connected to your smart TV, that kind of stuff. AI was machine learning. AI basically is an artificial intelligence, and it's usually more on a higher level where you're mimicking human behavior. Machine learning is where the computer itself or whatever device is capable of self-improvement without actual input. That means you're not actually programming and telling it what is better, and it can actually learn by itself. And then you have deep learning as well, which is more multi-layered networking. So you're using different machines to learn from each other, but it's not really, you're still involving some level of programming. Right, that is basically that. Sorry, I went about half an hour over, but there was a lot of content to cover. You can connect with me on LinkedIn, you can scan, my email is here, and I'll send the slides as well.
Yeah, and thanks, Chin. But if anyone has any questions, because we're already over time, just email Chin with your questions.
I'll hang around for a bit if there's any questions.
If there's any questions, okay, if anyone wants to. But before we go into questions, though, we are hosting another event next week on attracting and hiring tech professionals for your team as well. So we will send out an email to all of you with those details, plus Chin's details as well. But yeah, if anyone has any quick questions for Chin, you might as well take a few. If not, then hopefully we'll see you next week at our next event.
Right, Ziad, I'll hang around. If you need to run off, you can run off. You can berate me for going so much overtime later.
That's good. It's perfectly good. I can stay for a bit. Okay. Well, so everyone's good. Anyways, thanks again for joining, people. Appreciate it.
All right, that's it then, I guess.
Yeah.
I'll close the room.